with TSS and Stormwater, Sources and BMPs. I'm Ryan Janik. I'm one of the founders of Mapistry. I'm a professional engineer and spent the past 13 years or so in the stormwater space. Three things that Mapistry does, but we do a lot of education both in person and online. The main part of our software is an online platform to manage the actual stormwater permit, inspections, weather alerts, rain logs, mapping, SWIPs, all of that is done through our software platform. And it allows companies to manage everything from one site to 100 sites and put them all on the same platform, make sure they're meeting all the monthly, quarterly, annual requirements, and really speeds up the paperwork process. And then the last piece we offer is really like a conventional consultant and engineering firm, everything from BMP design to trainings to developing SWIPs and site maps, kind of filling in the gaps wherever we can't do it with the training and software components. Today we're talking about TSS problems. Many industrial sites have them. The key thing to remember, TSS is everywhere. Two things: source control. Whatever you can do to minimize TSS from getting in your stormwater on your ground surfaces is going to help you in the long run. And housekeeping, if it does hit the ground, what can you do from a housekeeping perspective to prevent it from actually going out in stormwater flows? Those are the two big things, and this is probably true of any best management practice or BMP that you employ for industrial sites. These two things are going to be your number one go-to BMP. For TSS especially, you really want to slow down the stormwater. What that allows you to do is it settles out the solids. So total suspended solids, the second part of TSS is all the dirt, inorganic, organic particles in the stormwater. You want to slow them down and allow them to settle out. And TSS Background, EPA benchmark, 100 milligrams per liter. California, a lot of states, most other states use this 100 milligram per liter benchmark. You can see California, Washington, Oregon, all have 100 milligrams per liter as their benchmark or action level for TSS. Some things to note, like in California, California has a 400 milligram per liter instantaneous benchmark, meaning if you exceed that twice in a given stormwater reporting year, you move into the next risk level. So there are some instant action levels that are used. For Washington, if you're discharging to a 303D impaired receiving water body, they use a TSS benchmark of 30 milligrams per liter, so a lot lower than kind of the general benchmark of 100 milligrams per liter. So sources, if you're looking at like on-site, maybe you have construction going on your site, maybe this is an industrial activity for you, processing of materials, graded road base here, any kind of stockpiles that could potentially be contributing to your TSS. This is a glaring source, hard surface, uncovered, no berm, no filter around it, big source of TSS on a site. The other thing could be track on. You may have trucks coming onto your site that are tracking on mud. Maybe they come from an unpaved site and are coming onto your site for processing. For example, if you operate a transfer station, you maybe have trucks picking up debris, trash, recyclables, etc., coming onto your site. They came off an unpaved site. They have mud caked onto their tires, and they're then bringing it onto your site. Another potential source is just nearby roadways. Maybe there's muddy roads from, construction. Maybe there's unimproved lots nearby, or maybe it's a more rural area. Nearby roads are bringing on sediments onto your site. The other thing is construction sites nearby. It could be track on to your site. It could be contributing to the roadways, then gets tracked on via employee vehicles or other traffic. It could even be if you have construction next door, it running onto your site. It could be blowing sand or debris onto your site. So some things to think about if you have TSS issues, some potential sources. And another one, a big one, is from your neighbor. Who's contributing to your own TSS? Do you have a swale or a curb cut or some sort of drain that's coming onto your site that's contributing TSS to your own problem? Unfortunately, once it's on your site, it's kind of your problem to deal with. There's not really a way to get out of it without going through some hassles. The other thing is your industrial processes or yourself. You may be doing aggregate processing. You may have some sort of TSS from that. But it could be your forklifts, if you're turning, braking, grinding, those small particulates are getting onto your surface. And we talk about it from a metals perspective, forklift tires high in zinc, but that also contributes to a TSS reading. That has a mass, that little rubber particle has mass to it. If it's winding up on the surface, it needs to be treated just like a dirt, sediment, sand, because it can show up in the TSS samples and potentially cause you to exceed benchmarks or action levels, etc. Same thing is if you have a site that's degraded, if you have degraded concrete, it's spalling, cracking, chipping up, especially near storm drains. I was talking about earlier, vacuuming around storm drains. But if you have worn pavement, worn concrete, these can be contributing small particles. And not only are you doing really good housekeeping from a sweeping perspective, but you have to be doing really good preventative maintenance on your physical infrastructure of your site, and making sure that you're not contributing, even though you're on a paved surface, sediment from the breakdown of your physical infrastructure. The thing is aerial deposition. So if you live in an area where there's mining or processing of sediments, aggregates, sands, gravels, rock, it's quite possibly, or if you just live in a windy area, high desert, other areas where wind-blown sediment silts can show up on your site. They can show up on your roof and then come down a downspout like you're seeing here, the staining. It's accumulating on a roof, and then once it rains, it comes out that pipe as a concentrated form of TSS. The other thing to pay attention to is historical sediments. Even though it may have been a while since you ever, popped a catch basin, popped a manhole, looked in there. If you have a lot of exposed sediment around your site or on your site, gravel, rock, driveways, parking lots, etc., generally over time that stuff winds up in your storm drain. So even though you might have implemented really good BMPs, there may be something historically underneath those storm drain inserts that's contributing to your TSS issues. So if you're having TSS issues, it's worth jetting and vacuuming out your storm drains. Please make sure that you do not discharge that wash water directly out through your stormwater system. Any maintenance contractor that's worth their salt is going to plug the end, put a back truck in there, and suck out and dispose of it properly. Do not just jet out and wash out your storm drains yourself and send it into the river. That is really bad. It's considered a non-stormwater discharge. Unauthorized wastewater discharges, please don't do it. With high TSS, there's a number of kind of go-to BMPs that I like to remove TSS, to reduce TSS, those type of things. On a site that's largely impervious, so it's got a lot of pavement, a lot of concrete. Sediment removal, sweeping. As much as you can do with sweeping is probably the number one BMP I recommend on TSS. If you've got an unpaved site, what can you do to put gravel down? Some people will use dust suppressants. There's kind of mixed opinions on that. You may get pushback from different regulators on potential groundwater impacts, runoff impacts, those type of things. So look into that if you're using dust suppression chemicals. But what can you do in terms of a paved site or even just like packed gravel? Sweeping is probably the best BMP out there. The inlet protection, looking at potential inlet protection. That could be filter socks, it could be inserts, those type of things can really help from a sediment perspective. And then clean out your drains. I always ask, if you have TSS issues and you're doing 1 and 2 and you're still having problems, what's in the drain? What is it that's there that's getting scoured out or contributing to your problems? Oftentimes this is more a metals issue because it's lower levels, but TSS still can be impacted by historical sediment deposits. And then when you're doing your follow-up sampling, if you're still having problems, obviously you're doing your TSS sampling, but look at particle size distribution, see what you're dealing with in terms of particle sizes. If you still are not hitting it with those first 3 BMPs out there and you're wondering why, you've put in filtration, why do I still have high TSS? Inspecting and changing out inserts regularly. It may be particle size, it may be very small particles that aren't being captured in the filtration. If those kind of first line BMPs aren't working, can you cover sources? Can you, temporarily cover sources prior to rain events? Can you pull tarps over? Can you cover them up? Is some sort of media filtration, like a sand filter, necessary? Sand filters can handle really high flow rates, really robust. If you have TSS issues, it may be worth installing a sump and pumping into a sand filter or installing a sand filter. Bioretention, you don't want to discharge stormwater if possible, so whatever you can do to infiltrate it, whether it's an infiltration gallery, a sand filter in the ground, a bioretention cell in the ground, whatever you can do to put it in the ground temporarily, or just while you're figuring it out, you can always put a temporary sand filter on your site. Things to think about: costs. What's your removal efficiency? What kind of flow rates? If you're over 1,000 GPM, sand filters on rent can start getting really pricey, and maybe you should look at some other strategies there. If you have really high flow rates, think about, is it all drainage areas that are contributing to your problem, or is it one smaller drainage area that you can invest in a sand filter or some sort of treatment system or covering for that small drainage area to bring the flow rate down. Specific BMPs, a couple things I often recommend is source control during the dry season. Here in California, where you have a very dry season, if you have a lot of sediment, think about how you can seal off your storm drains during dry season. Can you put a piece of rubber down and put a piece of sheet metal over it and prevent any kind of sediment from getting into the storm drains? And that prevents historical sediments, it prevents buildup during the wet season when you're actually sampling. Sweeping, clean out storm drains, and then filtration systems is kind of the last thing I would go to. I would try filter socks, check dams. Gravel socks work really, really well. So overall, keys to TSS compliance: housekeeping, source control, and then keep it as simple as possible. KISS principle: keep it simple, stupid. Sweeping, source control, regular training is the best BMPs you can make out. This was a follow-up question to TSS and metals or aluminum linkage. How do you approach somebody that may be a neighbor that's contributing? There's a couple of sources out there. Depends what state you're in, but you can find a lot of data. If they are a neighbor that has an industrial permit, I would be pulling all their sampling records, their industrial potential pollutant sources. And you can do this in California, it's public. Other states, it's public information. Federally, it is publicly available. You can go on the EPA website for certain states. The other thing is I would file a Freedom of Information Act request if I know they have a permit with the state agency to get their data and SWIPs. And then I would also be looking at, what are some historical potential sources. There's often, if you're worried about like underlying soils, there's often geology maps, and you could start looking at some like rock formations or subsurface conditions to look at, what has high, say, aluminum contents in it. In terms of talking directly to neighbors and they don't have an industrial permit and they might have run-on, that's really tough to do, and it may be a litigation issue where if they're contributing run-on to your site that is high in aluminum and is causing you to exceed permit requirements, and they really should have an industrial permit, it may be worth getting in-house counsel or external counsel involved. In terms of biggest issue, collecting the samples, how do you do it in the middle of the rainstorm to get enough people out there? Accurately collect samples. TSS, big problem. Number one thing on sampling in TSS that we see is people collecting samples that they scrape the bottom. So if you have staff that's responsible for sampling, tell them to go get a sample, they go out there, they go out and they scrape the ground surface, or they sample a puddle, or they stir up some sediments. If it's out of a catch basin, they scrape the bottom, they drop it down on a stick and scrape up the sediments. All problems with sampling in TSS. It's not really your industrial process, it's your sampling technique. And that's what we find. Somebody was asking about, what are we able to get TSS below? A lot of what we spend time on is training. Training is a big part of it, and that includes sample training on how to collect a representative sample from an industrial site so that you're not exceeding TSS limits unnecessarily. So, quick reminder, if you guys want help with training software services, please let me know. We use the software as much as possible because it is really much more cost effective, time effective than consulting services. And it gives facilities real-time insight into their operations and what the status is and how things are going. It also helps spot problems before they start. We're pretty actively involved in monitoring our customers' facilities and working with them. That's one of the reasons why we've been so effective at reducing, say, TSS below 100 milligrams per liter. It's not just put a BMP and walk away, but staying actively involved. And that's one of the big differences between probably us and any other consulting company